we'll have the framework to understand offensive cyber operations in warfare. Mr. J. Healey, deeply experienced speaker, analyst, author, and practitioner with wide-ranging cybersecurity and risk experience in think tanks, finance sector, White House, military intelligence, and academia. He's the former cyber strategist at the Officer of the National Cyber Director, founding director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and MCPA advisor. Welcome, sir.
Hey, thank you very much. Good, this is working. The slides will come up. Thanks for being here. Got my order of Thor. Thank you to MCPA. And helped set up the very first Joint Cyber Command. So we started in 1998. I'm going to hit 1998 when my slides come up, because it was a really important year. We didn't just stand up the JTF-C&D, which I got to do as a relatively young captain. But we'll see there's a couple other things that I think really helped drive our community, not just the command, but in our thinking. And some of that helped and some of it hurt. And this really hits to where Chris kicked us off today. Can I get my slides up? Do I need to press something? Is that on me? Nope. So this is vamping in the community. This is stalling while the slides are coming up. Do I need to do anything? No, I have the clicker, but yeah, it's just rotating between them. Because we need to get, right, a lot of what Chris was talking about. Remember, he talked about those 3 books, right? He talked about the Bomber Mafia. He talked about Moneyball, Michael Lewis, and Execute Against Japan. And a lot of this is we've got to be doing better, right? And we heard the chief senior enlisted advisors talking how we do better on how we deliver, how we can do better for our teams, how we can do better for our people, how we can be more efficient and more effective. But some of this comes down to how we think about the problem. Chris was talking about how in the Pentagon we've got to do better to be seen as capable. We need to have the warfighting commanders understand that what we can deliver, and we can be sure about that. We need to be able to do better at understanding what's happened in the multiple decades of cyber conflict history. So I wrote the first military history of cyberspace. It goes back to 1986. The first clear time you see adversaries in this back and forth. You had cybercrime before it. You had worms and other things before it. 1986, the first time you have these, you can really see on the unclassified side. These adversaries in this back and forth over time with their competing offense and defense objectives. Okay, I've got slides. I don't have to stall anymore. Because what I wanted to get down to, where I started on this research, I'm at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs right now, was one of the central questions. We go back and forth, and Chris hit this, right, of how important are offensive cyber operations actually going to be in modern warfare, especially not the warfare we've been seeing over the last 25 years, where it was the United States as really the only technical participant in the contest. And we were working against in counterinsurgencies and civil wars. That's not what we're going to be facing. So how much can we expect OCO to be decisive? Was how I got here. I'm sorry. I'll try back a little bit. So is it going to be revolutionary, or is it going to be barely relevant? And unfortunately, this is where a lot of the conversation tends to be, right? A lot of us here are on the enthusiast side, and we're arguing for it. A lot of commanders and others are saying, yeah, but I'd rather have that extra F-35 that Chris had talked about. And there's great evidence on both sides to be making both of those points. And by the way, this is an article that's going to be coming out in Texas National Security Review probably by the summer. I assume we'll have the slides up. And so I really wanted to dive into this. I want to talk about 3 things that happened in 1998. I only have slides for 2 because only one of them hit me recently. In 1998, we had the Joint Pub 313 from the Department of Defense. Prior to 313, every service was thinking, man, how's this information warfare going to work? you had this ferment within the services, especially out of the PME institutions, of thinking about. In the United States Air Force, where I was, you had documents from the secretary and the chief on down saying, all right, well, in the air, we do defensive counter-air and offensive counter-air, interdiction and close air support. What happens if we put information into each one of those? What's offensive counter-information, defensive counter? What's information interdiction? What's close information support? And how do we think about that? It was really exciting, but it meant that everybody was different. So DoD came down and said, forget all of that stuff. We're now going to talk about CNA, CNE, and C&D. So shut up about defensive counter-information and the rest. That's what we're going to talk about. And unfortunately, a lot of times when we're talking about offensive cyber operations, we're still stuck with those doctrinal definitions that's prevented us from thinking any further. Also around 1998, then Major Greg Rattray wrote the first PhD in international relations on cyber, where he was taking up exactly what Chris Cleary was talking about this morning. He said, boy, in the Army Air Corps, we started with this bomber mafia that promised the bombers would be able to win the war. They promised, they had mathematical formula, and it turned out not being right. And he then extends that into looking at the early cyber power enthusiasts and said, all right, how can we look at this? So he came in, even we worked together at Headquarters Air Force in the information operations, kind of as a doubter of saying, boy, this can be really tough, right? It can have a really important role, but a lot of things have to go right. It takes a lot of planning, it takes a lot of capability, it takes a lot of smart people to do it right. So I would put him on the, not necessarily a doubter, but it's really tough. Also in 1998, the U.S. Navy smart ship. Anyone know the story? About number 48, the Yorktown. Anyone know the story, what happened to the Yorktown in 1990? Okay, they decided it's going to be a smart ship in 1998, and we're going to make it a smart ship. We're going to be able to save 10% of the crew, 10% fewer crew, because it's a smart ship, because we're going to be running NT across the entire ship. Until we had a divide by zero error, and the ship had to get towed. Because one divide by zero error led to the system crashing. Microsoft wasn't very stable back then. Ian and others have made it better now, right? So for me, 1998 was a great year because you had some people coming out saying doubter and saying, boy, this is going to be harder than you think. But for the cyber enthusiasts, you say, boy, if you have a total casualty of one of the most powerful ships that has ever sailed from a divide by zero error, what can actually happen when an adversary is really trying to seek out trouble? And so this led me to really say, boy, we need to have a better understanding about this field to be able to dive in. So we not be able to not just talk generally about OCO in the doctrinal definitions, but to dive in and have a better framework to talk about these things. So this is one way that we might do it. I look forward to your feedback. I call it the framework of cyber operations and warfare. Yes, this didn't go to the academic talk, which we have two areas. One, the location and the timing of the OCO. We need to do a better job of talking about, in general, are we talking about OCO that are happening before the hostilities, phase 0 and 1? Are we talking about during hostilities? So now we're in armed attack, we're at war with someone, but it's happening in the rare echelon or before an important tactical engagement, or are we actually talking about the OCO in the particular tactical engagement itself? As far as I can tell, we have not, at least publicly, been making these distinctions when we're having these conversations. Also then, compared to the intended military purpose of the offensive cyber operations, which we can't just go with the doctrinal definitions. So everything from exploiting information, attacking the information networks, IT systems, attacking trust, erode morale, trust in the military systems, or defeating physical infrastructure weapon systems. So this predates Daniel Moore's book, Offensive Cyber Operations, but I really have a debt to Daniel because he brought out like making distinctions between presence and event-based operations. And also he really makes a great point of highlighting that so much in our field isn't just disrupting the system itself, but if you can undermine trust in the system, then you can have a similar effect. And he does a great job in his book. So if you haven't bought his book, please do. I'll reference it later again. And now this framework helps us speak much more intelligently about offensive cyber operations. And by the way, in my research, I didn't find anything else that was in the same space as this. If some of you have known this in the classified or unclassified space, please do let me know. So for example, it helps us understand gamma radon much better, of saying, okay, good, that was during the hostilities, but it wasn't meant to have battlefield impact, it was meant to be happening before the battle. We don't have a lot of examples of attacking trust in military systems as a primary purpose. But we do have some where it looks to be secondary. So some of the Russian hackers that hit the Delta Ukraine battle management system went public with it and seemed to be claiming more access than they actually had. Now, they might have been doing that for ego. It's really hard to associate pure motivation to attackers, as we know, but it does look like they were trying to do it. Of course, defeat physical infrastructure. You know, we know Black Energy of what they were trying to do. Obviously, that was during hostilities. It was post-2014, so there's still a war going on, but you get my point. We have very few examples of during hostilities, of actuals on the public side, about offensive cyber operations during the actual tactical engagement. I'm sure on the classified side, where you'll have more examples. On the public side, we don't have many. Israelis' Operation Orchard against Syrian air defenses, which might have had a secondary trust effect, right? To be making the Syrian air defense operators, or anyone that was operating that old Soviet, Russian air defense equipment, to be able to doubt what was on their screens. So I doubt that was the primary task, but it did have a secondary. So again, the framework allows us to do much better about these different areas and understand about our OCO much better. Again, as I said, there's not a lot of examples of trust being the primary, and very few public examples about on the battlefield. Where I really want to get more on where I can get on the public side is drones in Russia, Ukraine. You're seeing a lot of some things that are clearly EW in the drone jamming, but you're also seeing these hints in the public record about hacking going on. Some Ukrainian hackers had gotten into the mission loading system for some of the Russian drones so that they could not operate. That wasn't quite in the tactical engagement. That was a little bit before the drones would launch, because it meant they weren't able to flash them with the software they needed. But we are seeing on the public side talk about each side hacking each other's drones, and they're not meaning electronic warfare. So I'm really expecting to get a lot more interesting research about that to help us understand what's happening, to both understand drone warfare and also to understand cyber warfare. But what really strikes me is that if I had been doing this in the fall of 2021, this would have been theory. Most of these cells would not have had examples in them. And I think this is a really important part for us, not just because it helps me make a nice framework that has examples, is that our experience of cyber conflict was predominantly made when states didn't invade each other for territorial gain. There was always an upper limit in our experience of cyber conflict. That ended in February 2022, where now our past experience of how cyber is going to be fought is going to be substantially different now, because states are willing to take bigger risks, and when they're willing to take bigger risks, they're going to be taking bigger cyber punches. So I want to get us back a little bit to talking seriously about cyber Pearl Harbors, because there haven't been any kind of Pearl Harbors over the last 25 years since the end of the Cold War, because states generally weren't doing that to each other. So we shouldn't have been surprised that cyber wasn't used in that way. Now that geopolitics is changing, I'm getting worried about that again. So just some last comments on further analysis, right? To get back to that first question, I actually dislike these framing of the questions that I first did it, because we too often frame what we're doing in cyber as a binary. Is it going to be escalatory or not? Is it going to be a revolutionary or barely relevant? When surely we need to be getting into, right? We're 25 years on in this, just of having a military cyber command in the United States. Since 1986, so we're well into this area to be asking under what conditions are each one of these things likely to be true. So one of the earliest, Martin Libicki, who's an academic, I think he's still with the Naval Academy. He was in this space before, but I think probably really before any of us. He had said this in 2014, and we know that's not true anymore. That well, if you're only gaining X, if you lose it, cyber, you can only lose X. Well, we know that's not true from what happened at the Yorktown, right? There's only 10% reduction in personnel. And yet the vulnerability that was introduced led to a complete casualty of the cruiser, would not have been able to conduct any kind of military mission whatsoever. Where looking at this framework really helped me think differently about offensive cyber operations. We're across these three areas. Well, AI, obviously. You don't need the framework to help us on that. But in these three of these other areas really helped think. Usually disruption at scale requires mass. If you want to disrupt an adversary at scale, you need a bunch of weapons, or you need them targeted really exquisitely well across a single point of failure. Cyber, obviously, potentially, I'm not saying we can do any of these things necessarily right now. Disruption is probably the easiest, because information can be easily copied. You can get mass in cyber in ways that you often can't in other areas. It's easier, in warfare, of course, you can commandeer the other side's weapon, right? They throw the spear at you, you pick it up, it's now your spear. You take over the tank, you capture the tank, it's now your tank. But that's difficult to do. It is possible in cyber that cyber could be more revolutionary because it allows you to commandeer at scale. If all of those tanks have the same common mode vulnerability, right? They all have the same vulnerability. You might not just be able to disrupt one of those tanks, you might be able to disrupt all of the tanks that have that vulnerability. Also, it's possible that if all of those tanks, or maybe a more near-term example, all of those drones have that same vulnerability, then they're no longer Russian drones, they're now Ukrainian drones, because you can take them over, right? Is that like super high-end revolutionary? Is that going to change the nature of warfare? No, but it's a trick that you can't do with more traditional weapon systems. And last, disrupting trust at scale. And here, Daniel Moore has the great example. It's a super scary example. I don't know if this is true anymore, but he gives the example late in the book, the Tomahawk Strike Network, where basically if you had logon credentials to the TSN, you can do anything. You've full rights within the entire Tomahawk Strike Network. Again, I hope this has been changed. So you can change the targeting of not just one missile, but of all of the missiles. And just think about if that happens early on, right? Many of us are veterans, are active duty, right? If you can no longer rely on your tool to do a job, we're going to do a workaround, right? We're going to have a bias for action. Okay, I'm not sure I can trust that system anymore. I'm gonna do other workarounds, and we might just, if we think there's an adversary in the Tomahawk Strike Network, right? We're just not going to use the thing, right? That to me is where you start looking at some of those really interesting, by not attacking the systems themselves, but attacking the trust, and where can you diminish that trust at scale? And the framework really helped me think about these kinds of these areas better. Framework also helped me think not just about where it might be revolutionary or relevant, but also on high uncertainty and variance. When I talk to my Army comrades, they would say, all right, if we were going to attack, we want at least a 3-to-1, better off a 6-to-1 if we're going to take, right? We can't have that in our field, because we've got, as my academic colleagues were said, we have super high variance. right? You might be successful at swatting away 99 attacks, but the 100th could get through. Your offensive cyber operation might work 99 times, and then someone upgrades from version 1 to version 1.01. It's exceptionally difficult to know beforehand if that's going to, which one of those is going to be true. And that variance, I think, is going to be very difficult for us to get past. So where I end up with, and where the framework helped me get to, was, boy, both the enthusiasts and doubters both have strong evidence for each of their positions. What particularly concerns me about the doubter's position is that, as we've seen, sometimes adversaries can be really stupid and do things that leave open vulnerabilities. I'm concerned that might be us this time, right? And the Germans in World War II, right, it was putting too much trust in their Enigma machines and underestimating what the adversaries could do. We also kind of underestimate, I think, what a particularly thoughtful commander who's willing to trust and take the risks and pursue this system, what they might be able to do with the offensive cyber operations. I think we're really getting a lot of those lessons right now from Ukraine. So I think this is the last, yeah. So frameworks like this can provide us both structure and transparency, so that when we're enthusiasts or doubters, we can stop talking past each other and we can say, all right, I doubt that cyber is going to be really effective during tactical engagements, but it might be really useful to provide exquisite intelligence to tell us exactly where all of the adversary are all of the time. That's great. We can have that in frameworks like this. And by the way, if you don't like this, well, this is going to get published. Please do your own version. I already mentioned drones and the overlap in cyber E and W. And like I said, prior to 2022, most of this would have been theoretical. We've had pretty much one high-end cyber fight between technological competent states. And we already ended up with examples in almost every cell of the framework. So whenever I hear someone say, well, cyber will never do that, cyber will never do this or the rest, right? We're in the earliest decades still of cyber warfare and cyber conflict, which unfolded in times when states generally weren't invading each other. So we've got a lot more cyber to learn. There are going to be a lot more lessons that are coming out. The lessons that we might take from Russia and Ukraine, say between what offensive cyber operations are able to do, are going to be really different if the United States decides to do Iran, or United States and Israel decide to go after Iran. Right? We're going to see a very different application of cyber power, or China against Taiwan. Right? The lessons from Russia are going to get learned, are going to get examined and learned from both sides. So let's not overlearn the lessons from Russia and Ukraine. There's going to be a lot more of these to come. Future commanders are going to do it better than the Russians did. And as I said, that's going to be published. This is going to get published with more examples. I didn't do a good job of citation to a lot of the other academics and practitioners and policy documents over the years because I only had a short amount. And one of my reviewers said, boy, this would be great if we can apply it to defensive counter cyber operations also. So we take a stab at that, but it does help itself a little more for offense. With that, thank you very much. I can take questions.
So we were talking about your first book, and I meet you every once in a while saying there really needs to be that second addendum. Where you saw your framework, what do you think are the most sort of impactful things that have happened since you sort of stopped writing your first book and sort of thought about it for the next generation?
Yeah, so my book finished in 2013. And we were already talking about the rise of professionals. So actually, after we talked about it, right, I was thinking about what chapters go into it, right? And you've got to be looking at, certainly since 2013, I think we've seen, yes, the rise of Cyber Command. I'd want a chapter on Cyber Command. I'd be interested in the blossoming on the civilian part of government with CISA and ONCD. But especially I'd be interested in, I think the biggest difference of cyber conflict from conflict in the other domains isn't the speed or the difficulty of the attribution or that you can affect someone from the other side of the globe. I think it's the role of the private sector. I mean, really none of the other areas, and this got brought up today that General Novotny brought up. But I think it's even more advanced, right? It just challenges our normal sense of civil-military relations in the sense of the role the private sector has, like the folks that we have here, right? CrowdStrike, Google Cloud, Mandiant, that just have an operational role, not a support role. So I would really want to look at the development of that, not just because it's important, but because it tends to be one of the areas most misunderstood by military. Right, we're military, right? We're trained in Huntington. We're trained in, right, the state's what's important. The government's in charge. There are strong borders. We operate in an area of little trust. People are always going to let you down. Like, the internet was invented opposite of all of that. Like, the domain was engineered to be the opposite of the military mindset. And so no wonder we kind of struggle to operate in the space and to understand how to operate with the private sector, who are operating and who are creating and maintaining cyberspace every day and defending it. So I would focus on that. As far as operations, I mean, your eyes glaze over, right? There's been so many campaigns that have happened over the last 10 years, right? It's difficult to say which ones are most important. If I were going to emphasize anything, I would want to try and get to. It's really difficult as a practitioner turned academic to say, all right, we know what they've done to us. But if you really want to understand the dynamics of a conflict domain, you've got to understand what punches we threw, what punches they hit us with, and what has been the back and forth between the two. Right? Deterrence works differently if the adversary thinks you threw the first punch. And a lot of our adversaries think we threw the first punch. But Iran is almost certainly correct. And so I would be really interested, as much as we could try and see that dynamic of the back and forth. It probably matters less now than it, because now a lot of the decisions have been made, right? The barn door is open. 2027 is getting closer, but thanks, Chris.
Within the boxes of your framework, have you done an assessment? So within the different boxes in your framework, have you done an assessment of cost versus impact on those examples?
I haven't, just because that's just a damn difficult thing to do anyhow, to try and look at that. It would be really interesting, especially I'd be interested for someone that's got the data, which would be IC. Microsoft could do it also. Google could do it, some of that also, and just saying, all right, what are the trade-offs here? Where did they seem to have, did an offensive cyber operation seem to have the largest impact, right? Like, we might imagine that the OCU on the battlefield is going to have the biggest impact. I doubt that's what we're going to see from Russia-Ukraine. I would suspect that, that's this the tactical skirmishing that we have back and forth. I suspect in the long term we're going to find out that it's been the intelligence, right? That it's not going to be the disruptive event-based operations. It's going to be the presence-based operations that did. Just to talk about some of our other work, because both Microsoft and Google Cloud are funding some of our work on cyber regulation, and where I'm really interested is I helped draft the new national cybersecurity strategy in talking about having a more defensible cyberspace. It's an idea that came from us at Columbia University, a more defensible cyberspace. Where I really want to mention is, how do we know if the internet's becoming more defensible or not? Not just are we doing a better job of patching, are we doing better job as defenders, for those of us that are blue? Not just are we doing better job at defending, but are we doing a better job of defending relative to the attackers? Because what we've had for decades is that we keep doing this, we're getting better, but the attackers are getting better at this rate. So how do we know if that's starting to change? And with that, I do have one more minute, but the barbecue line is probably starting soon, and so we need to get to barbecue. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to MCPA. Thank you to the sponsors. Thank you to you, ma'am. Oh. There's a little... Yeah, okay.